Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline from the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Today we've got the second in a two-part presentation. A couple months ago, our presenter, Dirk Van Rossum, provided a presentation, and we realized there was going to be a lot of good stuff in the content, and we decided that following up with a follow-up webinar was going to be time well spent. Few housekeeping details. The phones are on mute, so it'll be myself and Dirk that you'll be able to hear. You have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat function to put those out there, and then we'll get to those later on. I will unmute the call later if people would like to talk and ask some questions. We just want to try to minimize some of the background noise. The webinar is being recorded, so that you'll have access to the recording after this, as well as anyone who else from your organization would like to benefit from that. And it'll go out to those that attended today's webinar, and as well as the people on our newsletter distribution list. A little bit of background information before Dirk gets into his slides. Some of the information that we talk about in our Foundations course is some theories about behavior change and what really does work as far as sustainability. And we know that there are theories that people try, such as the Field of Dreams theory, which gets people excited, perhaps some exhortations and slogans, a temporary excitement, but doesn't lead to sustained improvement. We'll see people try a document theory where they understand the importance of key behavior indicators, and we'll write up voluminous documents and send them out to people, perhaps even have them sign their names to indicate that they read it, and that perhaps that will show up in their personnel record. But it usually doesn't work, usually ends up in a trash can or a folder somewhere, doesn't lead to behavior change, and certainly isn't sustainable. And then finally, of course, there's the last resort, using extrinsic motivation and the beat 'em up theory, which you can get anybody to do anything out of compliance. But does it really lead to commitment, and is it going to be a sustainable change? And what we've noticed is there is a theory that does work, and it requires some work by leadership in the beginning to really understand the principles about what we're talking about, principles of enterprise excellence, and for them to define what that translates into as far as ideal behaviors that then they can then start to practice and start exhibiting, which also means they're going to be changing some of the conversations they're going to be having, and the different messaging that they're going to be conveying, and being the role model for what this means. And this is something that can't be delegated to anyone else. It really is something that they have to think about and start practicing. And it means change. It means practicing new behaviors. Then at a certain point, they're ready to start building simple systems that are able to reinforce those ideal behaviors. Too often people want to jump to the system build part, and they haven't taken the time to really think about, so what does this really mean as far as behaviors? And so jumping just to step number 4, we've found simply won't work. That could be one of those failed strategies. We also help people through the use of understanding a system, about how do you think about a system and how do you use that to define a system, and practicing different behaviors, and then getting real specific about what that means as far as the structure. And last month's presentation, we had a great presentation from our friends at the Mayo system in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and they've been using this method, and they shared some examples of this method, and they're finding good results in that. And one thing to think about using this methodology is that we want to make sure that as people are trying to understand the limitation of the program path of getting results through tools and then pushing those tools into systems, we want to make sure that what we're proposing is not seen as using that system standard is not a tool that you want to push into the organization. That just won't work. What we're talking about is reversing direction, thinking about connection to the purpose of the organization, understanding those principles, and then thinking about how you can use that system matrix, that system diagram in thinking about how do you build some structure to help people to exhibit the ideal behaviors you want to see, so that you're driving those ideal behaviors, and people are then using the tools that they invent, that they own, and they're going to be using those to get to the future. So those are my introductory remarks. I'm now going to turn it over to Dirk, our presenter today. And thanks again, Dirk, for doing this. He's done a yeoman's job of putting together part one, and now we're going to hear about some of his continued learning with part two.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity. I enjoy doing this, so I appreciate being able to do this with you and to share some ideas with you on our thinking on systems thinking, what systems mean, and different ways of how to go about introducing that into the organization as part of a cultural transformation to a lean transformation. And our experiences with this so far and our thinking about this particular topic. As Mike mentioned, as I started digging into this some time ago and prepared for the first webinar that we did, we quickly realized that there's much more than out there about this topic that we can squeeze into one webinar. And now we've reached this point where we've got a part two that we're going to be talking about today. And very interestingly, in the meantime, there's more discoveries, more information to be shared, more knowledge to be gained and shared. That probably prohibits us from squeezing everything into two webinars. There's just too much out there. So I'll give a stab at what we've found so far and what's pertinent right now relative to our journey up to this point. So with that, then, very warm welcome on a balmy afternoon here in Naples. It's 75 degrees, the sun is shining. There's a nice breeze blowing through the palm trees in the garden outside, and it's just a very nice place to be here in this paradise town on the Gulf Coast of southwestern Florida. For your information, if you're not familiar with NCH, we're a not-for-profit healthcare facility or system with 2 hospitals totaling about 716 beds. Serviced by about 730 physicians, and in 2016 we had 40,000 admissions, a number of surgical procedures, a lot of them ortho, and we're part of the Mayo Clinic Care Network. We have 4,300 employees approximately, and we're spearheading the Blue Zones project here in Southwest Florida. So that's a little bit about NCH in general. Our purpose for today. So as Mike already indicated, and per my previous presentation as well, is we're trying to explore what effective ways there are to aid learning and teaching and the application of systems thinking in the context of a lean transformation in an organization such as the healthcare organization. And we'd like to discuss things like mental models and systems thinking today, and also share some thoughts and ideas on practical ways to apply this systems thinking in practice. In particular, some objectives maybe that we can set for ourselves for this afternoon's talk is to get a deeper understanding of what a system is, more about how we think, as well as the consequences of non-systemic thinking, and that's very prevalent in industry today, and then a way to adopt systems thinking in our organizations and thoughts about how to impart that knowledge. A little bit about our journey. This is a newer version of our roadmap. I apologize for the fact that the writing is a little bit off out of the blocks, but that's okay. I just wanted to highlight a few points. So we've been on our journey as it is right now from about 2014 onwards. In 2016 in particular, the past year, we focused on going a little bit deeper on principles and behaviors with our senior leadership team, to get them to do Gemba walks and to get them to attempt to create a simple system to get them Gemba walking. And in 2017, we were building on that by adding teaching on the understanding variation, because to me that is very closely related to understanding systems and systems thinking. And then to get the senior leadership team during the course of the year to start thinking about some simple systems beyond Gemba walking, and to then also apply this in Kaizen workshops we're doing where we happen to have pool, as well as with our model cells that we've got in progress to apply some basics of and build some simple systems in those areas of the organization. Just some highlights pertaining to our overall transformation and the topic of systems in particular. So as per the slide that Mike showed earlier, we've taken a note of this as well, and this is really what we're trying to do, particularly with regards to behavior in the organization and the culture changes. We started working with our leadership team on the one hand, and then in parallel with model cells. And with our leadership team, we've really tried to follow this model where we've looked at particular principles and the associated behaviors we wanted to adopt. To start practicing, defining them, practicing them, creating new conversations, and that has been happening. So that's been really good. And then with that, start identifying little systems to build to get practice in that. And the first thing we did was really, as we came up with the idea, apart from the caution that we shouldn't be mechanistic in our approach, is that we had an opportunity to think of a system, and that was Gemba walking. We use Gemba walking as a vehicle to start learning and defining and practicing these new behaviors, but then we also realized we need some sort of system around that to actually keep it going and to have some form of sustainability in those early steps that we're taking in the organization. So that's really where we were coming from and what our approach has been, and our connection to systems thinking. And then previously also we shared, and this is again a version of the system standard template that we've adopted to try and use as part of this journey. So where are we right now? So we took some actions, we discussed that in our previous presentation, and we've moved along now, and it's time to reflect on how we're doing. So using the Toyota Kata questions, the 5 questions that Mike Rother has introduced, if we go to the back of the card, we'll find some questions there as well. And the first 2 are, what was the last step you tried, and what would you expect to accomplish? So what is your current situation now, really? And what we try to do is to learn 3 principles and their associated behaviors at the leadership level, and to teach some systems concepts to the leadership as well as management, to define a Gemba walking system for the leadership team, to apply the system standard template in events or Kaizen workshops, and also to research systems thinking as a broader subject. We expected to accomplish a few things with that. One was to transform our conversations and behavior amongst the leadership team around the 3 principles and the associated behaviors, to get a conversational understanding of systems concepts as we do Gemba walks, and to start seeing that the senior leadership team is conducting regular Gemba walks at a minimum of 2 times per month in pairs at least, and with or without a coach. We also expected to get a beginner or an intermediate proficiency in Gemba walking amongst the leadership team by December 2016, to build some other basic systems as needs arose, and to find better ways in the meantime to get people to learn systems thinking. So what happened? Let's take a look at that. So the further questions in the back of the cards: how did this turn out, and what happened, and what did this reveal, and what did we learn from that? Well, just in short, we got stuck on some obstacles during the workshop that we held to implement the initial Gemba walking system. So we had a lot of side conversations, and we ended up going off track and running out of time, which then led us to not being able to build a complete draft on the system standard with the team, and only come up with a very basic structure to govern Gemba walks. We also got stuck on conceptualizing systems. That remains to be a challenge in the conversation. So what we introduced wasn't sufficient to have informed conversations with when we went on Gemba walks. And then the Gemba walks themselves didn't take place as envisaged with what actually had been structured. And we'd also discovered that there was a lot more to learn about systems. So what do we learn about that? We discovered some underlying mental models during our workshop that are at the root of resistance to change. And we also learned that it would have been better in retrospect to just bluntly follow the 5 questions. So when you get to what are the obstacles, log the obstacles, move on, and don't get stuck in the weeds. Or then pick one obstacle and work on it rather than just discussing them. Or just to simply complete the system standard and see what it gets you to get you a framework to work within. So that's a lesson learned there. It's also helpful to provide a specific topic for Gemba walks for executives and senior leaders, I believe. You know, we're talking about new concepts overall. If you think about all the lean terminology and so forth, things to go look for on a Gemba walk, once you are on your way in a lean transformation. But when those things are not in place, then what do you go look at? What do you go talk about? So it's important to have some sort of topic for them to focus on and base their conversations on. So all is not lost. This was a really good exercise. We're just simply going through next iteration. The participants in our case learned that their approach didn't work, and they've asked us to hold another workshop to take us to the next level. So that's good news. And with regards to the systems thinking in general, the discovery there is it's a very broad subject. It's very deep, but it's also not very common in general and not commonly in use. So there's a very deep chasm between people who know something about it and a lot of people who don't know anything about it. And how do you breach that or bridge that chasm then is the question. Some other systems experiments that we've done at NCH are the following. We have in the pipeline an idea generation management system for our respiratory team. They've come with a request at some of the pool that we've had to come up with a visual system to keep track of and log their improvement ideas and how to manage that. So we'll be using the system template there. And then the infection prevention team wanted to do a workshop and did a workshop on improving the way they do their audit rounding. So the system template was used there. And the feedback from that was that it worked really well. It was really useful to identify the ideal or desired behaviors first and then build a process around that instead of doing it the other way around and trying to fit behaviors to a process that's already predefined without considering the behaviors at first. So that's a really useful sequence of doing things. And of course, behaviors aren't first. The purpose of the system and the outcomes that are desired come before that. But in terms of relative importance, the behaviors to talk about that first before you build the process actually works really well. The other comment was that it was a really powerful learning aid and also a teaching aid, functioning as an internal reference. So when people come to you with a request, it's very easy to quickly adopt the structure of their template in your mind to think about things like, well, what is the purpose of the system? What are the outcomes we're trying to get? What are the behaviors? What are the processes we need? What are the tools we need? Or what are the triggers we're going to need to put in place to get all of this to work together? So it really helps to clarify the thinking process. So that's our discovery with the use of that template in particular. Talking about systems, the notion of organizations as systems is pretty well known. And what's interesting is when you ask people, you know, do you agree that you can see an organization, this organization, your hospital, your healthcare system, that it should function as an orchestra, or it's like a football team. There's different roles and they all need to play together in order to get the job done and the purpose met. And the answer typically to that is yes. There's agreement with that notion. But what happens in reality? In reality, it doesn't really work that way, we find. So why is that? So that's something I want to explore in today's conversation. And then the other point here with systems and organization is that the system structure determines the behavior. If you think about it, the way the football field is laid out, the different roles, the rules of the game, all determine how the players behave generally. Same with an orchestra. The music and the different instruments, the harmonies that are required, etc., determines how the music comes out. Same in an organization. Another point about complex adaptive systems is that they are functioning on a set of simple rules. So let's explore that a little bit further. What I have in mind here is on the left-hand side on the top you see a swarm of starlings. I don't know if you've ever seen that. You know, all these little birds by the thousands swarming and flying through the sky, and somehow they maintain formation. They change direction very frequently, and we know some of that behavior is in order to avoid predators, certain hawks that prey on these starlings. But how is it that they don't fly into each other and crash to the ground by themselves anyway? Same with fish, you know, bait fish. They form these big balls in the ocean in order to look larger, so to be intimidating to a predator perhaps, and also to preserve themselves. But how is it that they manage to stay in formation and keep direction? Similarly with geese flying in formation, you know, how do they know where to go? How do they know how to conduct themselves relative to each other? And then there's a human equivalent to that, as cyclists. being a cyclist myself, I'll use that as an example to kind of explain this. So when you're in a group of cyclists like this, imagine you're the cyclist in the front, the guy in the light blue outfit. What are the rules that you need to comply with? Well, you need to follow the route that's been laid out for where you're driving or riding. In this particular case, it's kind of governed by the road, and then whatever the race has been determined which roads to follow. There might be a lead vehicle that he's following in the distance. What else? Well, there's a certain pace that he needs to maintain. And then if he's got riders to the left and right of him, he needs to keep a certain distance from them. But invariably, most of the other riders follow the lead rider. So there's roles and rules there. Then for the rest of the riders, what's important there? Well, you need to keep safe distance from the riders on either side of you. You need to follow the rider in front of you, not too far, not too close, so you can get a good drafting effect. And don't overlap your wheels so you don't get knocked over if there's a sudden change in direction. So there you can see you've got a complex adaptive system of lots of independent parts interacting with each other, and together they ride safely as a group. And as a group, they can perform better than as individual riders. So just to demonstrate that particular principle of simple rules in complex adaptive systems. So we've got structure and we've got simple rules that have to do with systems. If we talk about system performance, Deming put it this way, that every system is perfectly designed to get the result it gets. Basically meaning that the results you get are a function of the design of the system, or the structure of the system. All systems function in perfect alignment with the underlying structure. And if we then see a gap, this is something I found from a presentation in a paper by Dr. Ed Chaplin, is that the gap that we see is not between the performance and the structure as such, because the structure determines the performance. The gap is in our expectations in the structure. So now we have the idea of simple rules, structure, and expectations. And if something is amiss, what should we look at? Well, perhaps we should be looking at our expectations. Because is there something wrong with the mental models that our expectations are built on? So something to think about, and that's the topic we really are going to explore here. So some thoughts about systems thinking then overall. We need to think about this because it's about thinking, and it's about ways to better manage our expectations when it comes to organizational performance. Some operational definitions, we just pause there. The one from IEX states it as follows: thinking about how and why components work together across the organization and the impact of individual areas and departments on the whole. Another one is a vantage point from which to see a whole, a web of relationships, rather than focusing only on the details of a particular piece, and that events are seen in the larger context of a pattern that is unfolding over time. And I like this last idea, is that you think about a larger context and patterns and unfolding over time. I think those are important ideas to bear in mind. And the idea of context also comes in with when you talk about variation reduction, for instance, and we'll tie into that. So how do we know that we know something, and how do we know what we think we know is really so? This is some questions I got off a presentation that Dr. Ed Chaplin did, and then I'd like to add to that, is that then how exactly do we think? And then how does this affect our mental models? So let's explore that a little bit. So Kahneman came up with and wrote the book on thinking fast and slow, and the main point here is we think in two different ways. One is very quick, the autonomous thoughts, automatic thoughts, and it ties in with skills learned, routines that we've adopted, patterns that we've learned, habits that we've adopted, etc. And the idea there is it's very quick, it's very fast. If the complexity is low, the accuracy is high, but once the complexity increases, the accuracy goes down. On the other hand, we've got slow, effortful mental activities that deal better with complexity. So typically that applies when we're learning something or when we're facing something new. And if you look at the little graph at the bottom, it shows that as the accuracy goes up over time, and you can deal with more complex situations. Examples, for instance, are learning to drive a car. If you think back to that, initially it was really difficult to get all that good coordination right, or learning to ride a bicycle. Now you drive to work, you don't even remember how you got to work when you think back on it, because it's so automatic. It's kind of scary sometimes. And the question then is, if you face complexity, do we really always use slow, effortful mental activity to deal with those complex situations? And what was interesting from a neurological perspective, the research that Dr. Chaplin did and reported on in one of the presentations I found is as follows, that oftentimes, a lot of the time, most of our day-to-day actions happen on autopilot. Most of our responses are reflexive, not reflective. Our responses are also emotional and not rational, and often we don't even realize that. We respond before we are even aware. We think less than we actually think we do. And there are two different types of knowledge that are physically stored in different parts of the brain, this fast part and the slow part. And then even often slow thinking is reflexive. So our thinking typically is efficient and fast, but contains biases. And the little chart on the right just indicates that as well. Is, we want high accuracy and we want high speed, but how do we get that then? Because if we just have fast thinking going on, we have high speed, but maybe our accuracy isn't that good and we're not aware of our biases. And the phrase that Dr. Chaplin also coined is, it's kind of like an app, with the modern day phones that we have and devices that we have. Our mind kind of works like that as well. We create apps for all different kinds of situations. One way we know of this also in the healthcare environment is that from a clinical perspective, clinicians are taught to pattern match. Those are different forms of apps to apply to different situations that they are confronted with. But we do that with so many things. And the interesting thing is, even with slow thinking, we also develop apps for that, and we follow those routine patterns of thinking when we are faced with certain situations. So that's a little bit about how we think. So now let's put that into the context of mental models and our view of the world. So if we have the world with a bunch of principles governing how it functions, and there's us with our mental models that are built on experiences that we've had in life, other people influencing us, the skills we've had from training, the knowledge we've gained from education, and then the values that we have from the culture around us that imbues us and affirms our assumptions, our habits and our beliefs and our presuppositions. The question I want to ask is, how are we thinking? So if we think back to what we just saw, is our thinking fast or slow most of the time? Well, typically from what we learned is it's fast and it's local. Well, what does that then mean in terms of the accuracy of our mental models? If we look at the world through these mental models, and these mental models reflect non-systemic behavior, and reality then as perceived is not equal to reality, that has some negative consequences. Our perceptions are inaccurate, and we have a predilection to misinterpret. So we get a double whammy negative there. Which is not good, of course, which then leads to system performance being sub-optimized. And our mental model reinforces the denial, and we stay stuck into this loop. And we can actually not see what's going on, and we cannot see the limitations of our mental models. So we're blind. So I've got the little sunglasses on there. And Deming talked about that as well, is that, when you're in the system, you cannot understand the system. This is one way of depicting that as well, as to why that is. So we need to get an outside perspective on that. So let's try and get that in the coming slides. But before we get there, there's some consequences with that. So what are the prevailing flawed mental models that we see, and what about that? So the one factor is, if we're blind to it, then these mental models are undefined oftentimes. They often called underlying assumptions that go unrecognized. And if they're invisible and not recognized, they become anchors that disrupt change or continuous improvement. And we often see that we try to introduce a change for the better, flow, whatever, by single piece flow, where the habit, for instance, is batching, and you often end up with a conflict type of argument that results because the underlying assumptions are not understood and are not made explicit. So a potential countermeasure idea here is, what can we do to make the existing mental models visible and explicit, so we can put the proper countermeasures in place and replace them with better underlying assumptions? And that's a thought that comes from theory of constraints, by the way. So typical flawed mental models that have existed in history, some of them have been surpassed, of course, is that the Earth is flat, the Sun orbits around the Earth. We still say the Sun rises in the east, but it doesn't. The Sun doesn't rise, the Earth is rotating, right? And then all variation must be responded to and routed out in an organization. If there's change in our results, then we typically want to react to that. Things like annual budgets, things like assumptions that optimizing the parts will optimize the whole, or things like ignoring the effect of dependencies and bottlenecks within an organization and ignoring the fact that there's actually a constraint governing how the system is performing. So we have this blindness. Similarly, with regards to our view of the organization and teams, we talked about that earlier and said, yeah, the notion of an organization as an orchestra or a football team is accepted. Verbally, at least, people agreed to that. But then in reality, what we get is this. We get bowling teams, not football teams, right? So a bowling team, each player in the team does their best. The scores are added up, and that's the score for the team. And they compete against another bowling team who does the same thing. And there's no interaction among the players in the team, and there's no interaction between the teams. It's ignored. And this is how we treat our organizations. Endo team, ED team, cardiac tele team, we work in silos, and that's the resulting prevailing model that we have with these mental models. Another undesirable effect I found really interesting, I found in an article by Reason, Carthy, and Lavelle, is diagnosing vulnerable system syndrome. This is just another way of saying the same thing. Studies have shown that with regard to risk management, such as employee safety in an organization, firstly, most organizations are complex in nature, tightly coupled systems, so it includes healthcare institutions. And what they found is that in such organizations, this is a mouthful, there are these interacting pathologies or behaviors, if you will, that imply and cause vulnerability to the risk. In other words, the risk of safety events occurring. And that these behaviors are self-perpetuating and they're recurrent and they interact with each other. For instance, there's three of them. There's blame of the individual, typically at frontline level. There's denial or even a blindness to the existence of error-provoking system weaknesses. And as you can see, if that's the case, if you're blind to that, then if something goes wrong, what do? Well, the only other choice is then to blame someone. So that's kind of a vicious circle there. And then the third one is the single-minded pursuit of the wrong kind of excellence, the wrong metrics. So a narrow-minded focus on productivity or certain financials. The sad thing is that this vulnerability system syndrome is very common in most complex organizations, and with that also that the organizations are blind to it. Very interesting article. I've got a little bit more about that. What they also talked about there is why that is. There's a prevailing mindset in such organizations that today is going to be another good day, and that single loop learning sufficiency is good enough. So if you look at the diagram on the right, if there's an action that leads to results and the results are not quite as desired, then there's an action to close the gap, but that's all. Whereas a different countermeasure would be just to have the attitude that today is going to be another bad day, let's be ready, look beyond the immediate, test underlying assumptions, understand variation, understand systems, and make systemic reforms. Or in other words, what's going wrong is that with single loop learning, there often is not enough problem solving down to systemic root cause. And there's a lack of understanding and variation, so the wrong actions take place. And then as part of the countermeasure, then again, the theory of constraints, the thinking processes there are very powerful in digging down to underlying assumptions. So it could be an avenue to be pursued and a tool to be used to help with this. Just a thought there. I'm not going to go into the TOC in today's talk. I'm just planting that seed. So what are why are these prevailing mental models off? Ross Ackhoff put it this way: the characteristic way of management that we have taught in the Western world is to take complex systems, divide it into parts, and then try to manage each part as well as possible. And if that's done, the system as a whole will behave well. And that is absolutely false. So it comes down to we've taught people the wrong way. So we've got a large gap to fill. Cabrera, in their book on system thinking made simple, raised these 6 points, and Mike in one of their IX white papers have also mentioned these six points of the thinking that's out of balance. Predominantly the overly focus on parts to the exclusion of the whole, that our views are excessively hierarchical instead of thinking about the more complex distributed networks that actually exist. Too much reliance on static categories rather than part groupings and broader perspectives. And another important factor, that prevailing views are too linear. So there's too much linear thought in cause and effect instead of seeing more indirect, non-linear webs of causality when something goes wrong. And we'll talk about how to counteract that a little bit with some basic approaches that we have in mind in the next few slides. There's also bias towards seeing structural parts but overlooking the dynamic relationships or the interactions, and also too much of a view of bivalent, so it's either or instead of and taking place. Just to give you perspective on that. So how do we overcome that? How do we overcome inaccurate mental models? How do we defeat poor habits? How do we unlearn what is common practice? Well, the thought I want to throw in here is, maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe we shouldn't be asking that, and maybe we should be saying, oh, okay, this should have crossed out the unlearn, not underlined it. Maybe what we should be doing is learning newer, better patterns, system thinking patterns. And if so, well, then what could those patterns be, and how could we do that? In other words, creating different kinds of apps that are going to replace the apps we've been defaulting on in the organization, that are more system thinking oriented, that are going to help us be practical system thinkers. So here's some of the things we've thought of doing and have started doing. So this is part of our hypothesis on how to do this. So when you have an improvement workshop, a Kaizen event, if you will, of 3, 4, or 5 days, clearly you've got some sort of identified problem or opportunity you want to work on that's been defined. And then you go about planning what you want to do and how you want to approach this. So here's some of the things we were thinking. To learn systems thinking patterns through the integration of a number of tools that we actually already use, but use them in such a way that we elevate the whole systemic thinking concept, if not explicitly, then implicitly. And that's what Mike and I were talking about before the webinar started, is, how deep do you go with this systems thinking in what do you need to teach explicitly and explain about systems thinking, and what do you simply just learn by doing and leave it implicit in how you go about doing certain things in new, better ways. For instance, we started using the Kata process, right? So we use it as a structure in our workshops to ask those questions of what is your goal, what is your target condition, what's your current condition, etc. To structure the thinking in general. And what we've started doing now is, in our workshop, we introduce the domino exercise. Don't know if you're familiar with that, but you set up a pattern of dominoes. The team has a target to achieve, a goal to achieve. Of course, they fail initially, so then they need to problem solve to get to their target condition that they need to define. And we use the 5 questions to coach them, and we actually document everything they do using the Toyota Kata method in this domino exercise. So they get to learn this process, using their minds on it, getting their hands dirty, playing with the dominoes, etc., and really having to think very hard about this particular situation. And it works really well. It's really great, and it's great fun, so it's non-threatening, which is really important. With that, we introduce the 5 why questions, affinity diagrams, and fishbones as well, to help them with their thinking process. We also use the understanding variation with the funnel exercise, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. There's things that you can do to get people to huddle in groups. If you've got a group of more than 12 people, get people to stand with their feet 2 feet apart from 2 other people, so you get people to form little triangles in the group, and they introduce a change, and you let them see how the entire group formation needs to adopt and adapt to absorb that change. Value stream mapping is another form where you start introducing systemic thinking because you're looking at the connection of things. And with that, the Lego game is really powerful to demonstrate the principles of flow and dependence and improvement of the whole as a system rather than point improvements. And then the whole context can, of course, be explained with the A3 and the whole thinking of the A3 at a higher level, similar to the 5 questions, where the first part is really important, is getting a really deep grasp on the situation, the overall situation, if you will, how the system functions. So the A3 thinking process also really lends itself well to starting to think in a systemic fashion. And then ultimately, as and when appropriate, if you want some sort of sustainability with whatever new way of doing things you come up with in that workshop with the team, you need to tie it down. So that's where the system standards template comes in, to have another form of documenting that so everybody can see how it all ties together as a system. So that seems to be a very good practical approach to subtly introduce ways of systems thinking in the way we do continuous improvement and problem-solving exercises. A little bit about the funnel experiment, for those of you who are not familiar with it. Very simple. You have a marble, you have a funnel, you have a sheet of paper on the table. You place an X on the paper as a target. You place the funnel over the X. You drop the marble through the funnel 30 times, and you mark the spot every time where the marble lands. You run 4 rounds. The first round, you don't move the funnel at all. You just mark all the spots, you draw a circle around it, and then you've got 3 more rounds where you move the funnel laterally in different ways in response to where the marbles landed. So you're adapting for the error that's occurring. And that's an example of tampering in a system, as Deming put it. And the point there is simply to simulate reaction to results rather than systemic changes. And what's really nice about this exercise is people get it. People really understand then, together with a presentation that talks about how to identify common cause and special cause variation in a system. And then you can also introduce things like, in our situation, what we've done is use a small marble relative to the diameter of the spout of the funnel. So it's got a lot of lateral movement in there, so you get a lot of variation in the result. And then if you introduce a marble that's larger and a tighter fit in the spout of the funnel, you get a much more precise result. And the point being there is the improvement to the system is dependent on a better interaction between its parts, the marble and the funnel spout. So that's a very useful way to demonstrate that principle in the context of such a workshop, and it's also a very fun thing to do and non-threatening to the participants. And that ties back to what Deming was talking about as well, as management needs to understand variation. Oftentimes we overcompensate when we see variation, and it's often better to leave things alone. And this is one of the challenges we are facing, is how do we teach people to, instead of don't just stand there, do something, take the situation and don't just do something, but stand there and actually be okay with that. And I think this funnel experiment is very powerful in trying to demonstrate that, and would be useful for people prior going to Gemba walks. So putting it all back together then, if we go back to the mental model, if we introduce systems thinking overall and create better apps of thinking, if you will, so simple rules and new patterns of thinking, we have a likelihood of getting an increased accuracy in our mental models, which means we're going to have a better perception in our reality of what the world's really like. So that's good. And we end up with more systemic behavior. We get optimized system performance. We get a systems culture taking place as well. So that's how the thing then would create a better situation. And also, when that is the model, you get an upward spiral or an expanding spiral of improvement rather than staying stuck in a rut. Great. So thoughts on overcoming fear. So all of this is a lot of change. This in itself is a subject one could do a whole webinar on. So I just have this one slide, just some thoughts to share. One of the things I've learned is coaching questions lead to self-discovery. And it's better if somebody discovers a solution to the problem themselves and then goes down that route than being forced or led down that way, because they'll have more resistance in the latter case. In the earlier case, if it's their own discovery, they're more likely to try something. It's important to build an environment of trust and to break the cycle of mistrust. Understanding of variation comes into play there. A place and time for improvement and experimentation needs to be arranged. One needs to applaud failed attempts at getting better, not just successes. And it's important to do Gemba walks, especially for the senior leadership team, to foster better relationships. First, focus on basic routines, as we discussed. Learn new routines and patterns through non-threatening and fun exercises, such as the Lego game, group shuffle, huddle, domino game, funnel exercise. And I've got an entire book on systems thinking, the systems thinking playbook, and it's in the list of references at the end of the presentation, with all kinds of exercises you can do to learn principles and concepts on systems thinking. And then proceed in small, rapid steps and create and ride the motivation wave. So if you have a workshop and there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm that instills, then be prepared to follow up very rapidly to actually ride that wave of motivation and get a lot of follow-on work done. So back to our situation and the 5 questions. What were the obstacles we came up with and where we are with our walk right now relative to systems thinking and Gemba walking? Our leaders are not adopting consistent and regular Gemba walk behavior, and the leaders are struggling to not do. So what are the steps we'll take? We're going to run another workshop in less than 2 weeks with the senior leadership team to build a Gemba walk system that will include additional education on systems. We'll do the variation with the funnel experiment. We'll create a Gemba walk system standard using the template. And then we'll also structure and align conversations around improving patient flow that ties back to a true north objective of reducing length of stay, so they have something to actually go and talk about and look and a reason to go look for things in the operations. And then in parallel, we also are looking at model cell improvement suggestions and visual management systems that we hope to implement. Next time, so that concludes the core of our presentation today. Next time, we hope to provide you an update on our experiments, if we can have a next time. Some more about thinking systemically, perhaps some mapping alternatives that exist out there, and then what others are doing to teach systems thinking out in the world. There's a lot going on in education on how systems thinking is being taught, and there might be some interesting things we can learn from that and adopt from that in our approaches. And then how to integrate system thinking with processes and from theory of constraints. So that's another area to be explored. Here's a list of resources. You can reference that when you look at the presentation again once it's been uploaded. Some of the material that I've used to educate ourselves here and to also use in this presentation. Thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation today. I hope this was helpful.
Thanks, Dirk. That's great. I have unmuted the phones if anyone has any questions that they would like to put forward, or observations about their experiences with trying to tackle learning about thinking and acting in a systemic manner. I don't have any questions from the chat function, so I'm leaving it up to the audience if they've got any questions or observations they'd like to add. Dirk, one of the things that you and I talked about is with the people that you're working with, their tendency toward bias toward action. And
yes.
what their desire is to learn. Patience to sit through a meeting or a presentation and call it the theory, but then wanting to get to it and actually do something. So it sounds like you've been experimenting with different ways. As said, my audience doesn't won't necessarily read perhaps a lot of stuff or sit through a PowerPoint, but they do want to do. So I think you've shared some good examples about what you've learned as far as what's working there. Any key takeaways or advice for anyone that perhaps might find themselves as well as far as managers that want to do bias toward action?
I think, well, one thing is I think you need to keep it short enough. You need to have enough material in there to have some sort of content, but don't overdo it so you don't get bogged down in the details and bore them with what may be an interesting subject, but not necessarily to them. So just give them their essence. I think that's the one takeaway from what we've learned. And then approach it in different ways. We've tried various things. One of the things we've done is prior to our workshops with the senior leadership team on a particular topic like principles and behaviors is we give them homework to do so. They're forced to do some sort of research, and there's a little bit of peer pressure when they report out when we have the session that they actually get it done. So that's another way to actually get people who maybe are not inclined to go read and research themselves, at least go look up something. Or you can send them a reference to a video. Video is always fun and easy to watch for people oftentimes. So we've used that mechanism as well to say, hey, why don't you look at this? It's got some important points there. And then we talk about it in the workshop briefly and note down some of the results. Another factor is people are action-oriented or want to be doing stuff, so then do stuff. So do the exercises, and that's one of the reasons I'm exploring different ways to introduce games and exercises so people can get their hands on. We did the similar thing with some of our senior leaders and a bunch of our physicians that are in leadership training, where we used the Lego game and the domino game, and I can't remember another game to actually demonstrate certain principles, structured problem solving, flow, and so forth. And that went down really, really well because they were actively engaged. And then if you then have a workshop and people have that background, they actually want to try to apply these things. So again, it's doing, but now they're doing things with the right mindset and with the right tools in mind. So those are ways that we found are effective.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. And also to share with the group that our team, IEX team, is thinking about some ways to facilitate some good questions that prompt discussion and reflection questions. And we'll have more to talk about that in the future. So again, something there. So if there's no questions from anyone in the audience, nothing coming up on the chat function, I'll just move on here. And just let you know that the recording is going to show up on our webinar page. So if you go to that URL there, you'll find our list of webinars. Dirk's great presentation from today is going to show up on a webinar recording. And Dirk, you're okay if I share a PDF copy of what you've shared today? Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So I'll include that as well. In February on the 20th, we've got a presentation connecting back to working on strategy deployment, drafting a white paper on the Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment, and some thinking from Ajay Raikar on strategy execution. And then in March the 10th, our friends from Decorah, Iowa, previously we had a presentation from their rehab department with Sarah Grew. And we've got three folks from the executive team, Lisa, Dave, and Sue, going to talk about some of the higher level work that they're doing. And they've been recognized as one of the top 20 critical access hospitals in the country. And so they're going to be sharing their results there. Friend and colleague Debbie McAllister at the end of March, talking a little bit about vulnerability and coaching and the power of that. So she's going to be sharing her thoughts. I've got a couple other webinars lined up, at least in the planning phases, reaching out to people, but nothing yet I can put on the calendar. But if anybody does have anything they'd like to share, or if there's any particular challenge points that people are working on that they would like to feature in one of these monthly discussions, please send me an email that way. And then finally, if you want to learn a little bit more about this method for thinking about systems and this systems template that we've referred in this webinar and previous webinars. There's a learning opportunity coming up. It's in about a week. So you can look for that. So Dirk, again, thank you for taking the time to put this together and presenting it today. Always very helpful. You gave the weather report for your side of the country. I'll tell you that it's not quite as warm in Minneapolis as it is there in Naples, Florida. So, and I doubt if I'm going to make it out on a bike ride today, but I do have that capability if I wanted to. So thanks again. Thanks everyone for participating today, and look forward to our next conversation next month. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.